Journalist and columnist Bob Franken. He has covered several presidential races and has reported from the White House and Capitol Hill. Also with us is Kyle Kondik. He is the director of the University of Virginia Center for Politics in Washington, D.C. Joining us from Florida is Ivan Eland. He is the director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. He's also worked for the U.S. Congress for 15 years on national security issues. Here in the studio with us as well is Andrei Sitov. He is the Washington bureau chief for the Russian TASS news agency. Welcome to all of you to the show. Bob, it seems elections in America for president get earlier and earlier each cycle. It's 20 months away from the election. We've just had Ted Cruz announce his candidacy. He is a Republican senator, deeply conservative. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, the election campaign for the next election begins the morning after the election that was just held. And that's certainly the case now, in addition to which, not only do you have the candidates, but you have a Congress, which is really just conducting a political campaign too. And you have a sitting president who's about to leave office in a couple of years, who's also trying to make sure that his successor is a Democrat. Now, as for the Republican Party, it has a real internal battle going on. It's the battle that the Republican Party always has between what they call the establishment, that is to say the people with money, who are more interested in pragmatically winning. Then you have the people who are the true believers. These are the cultural conservatives, the people who are religious conservatives, and the rest. And that is the group that Ted Cruz, among others, is trying to appeal to. So you have this internal tensions plural, that are going on in the Republican Party.
Kyle, of course, everyone is waiting for Hillary Clinton to announce her candidacy. She's made no secret of the fact she wants to be president, the first woman president in the country. When she does make that announcement, how does that change the entire race in the country?
Well, she actually has to start campaigning, and she will have a campaign apparatus and that sort of thing. Also, you're going to see a lot of these announcements come in early April, it seems like, because the fundraising is done every quarter, and so there's 4 quarters in the year, and the candidates like to get in at the start of the quarter, which is the start of April, in order to have as much time as possible to raise as much money as possible. It's kind of inside baseball thing that happens with these elections, and so it sounds like U.S. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky is probably going to get in early April. Hillary Clinton probably going to do that too. Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, and so we're going to have this domino of announcements coming here pretty soon.
Ivan Eland, in Florida, will foreign policy play a big role in the upcoming campaigns? Foreign policy normally doesn't get to feature in campaigns because it's all about domestic issues, normally economic issues. But now we have a lot of issues on the table. We've got probable deal with Iran that's coming up, Islamic State, the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the relationship with China, the relationship with Russia. So do you see foreign policy featuring in the campaigns?
Yeah, I think it might be. Usually U.S. elections are decided on domestic issues unless there's some overriding crisis. But I think you've got enough little crises at this time that that might add up to a big one. And I think certainly, at least in the Republican primaries, it may be an issue because the Republican Party's become more hawkish as a result of the beheadings and the ISIS problem primarily. And so I think foreign policy, at least in the Republican side, may be an issue with Rand Paul against everyone else, arguing that. And then in the general election, Hillary's pretty hawkish, and probably Rand Paul is at a disadvantage. So both candidates may try to, be more hawkish than the other one.
Andre, the relationship with Russia, it's nosedived under President Obama. Come the new election cycle or inauguration of the new president, do you see that changing?
Frankly, before the show, we were talking, and one of the things that occurred to me was how little practical difference was between the latest Republican president, George W. Bush, and the current incumbent, the Democrat, Barack Obama. So I certainly hope that there is change, that we come back to something more normal than what we have now. But I will believe it when I see it.
Going to have to push that reset button again, Bob.
Well, as we pretty much agree, usually U.S. elections are determined by domestic considerations. And there's certainly a number of them. But you have a world that's going, pardon the technical language, kablooey. You have a Mideast where it's so tangled, where you have allies who are fighting allies who are suddenly our friends. I'm talking about Iran, of course. You have ISIL, or whatever you want to call it. That is a big surprise. Remember now, we weren't even aware of that group until at least a couple of years ago. It was a big surprise, which says something about our intelligence capabilities in the United States. You have the question, the deteriorating or certainly changing relationship with Israel. All of that is causing a lot of focus on what we call in the United States foreign policy. You have the negotiations going on with Iran now about nuclear disengagement by Iran, all of that. And it's the kind of thing that has become such a political issue that members of Congress wrote that letter to the Iranians, which went behind the president's back, something that is almost unheard of. You had the head of Israel, the prime minister of Israel, invited to speak before Congress without the knowledge of his fellow head of state. Actually, I guess Netanyahu is not a head of state. You had the president, the Republicans went behind his back. So that is going to be a huge issue, foreign policy, in the U.S. election.
Carl, the other candidates who would be looking at getting the Democrat nomination, it seems, and you know, the talk is right now, this is going to be a shoo-in for Hillary Clinton. I mean, where do the major challenges for her come from?
You know, I think that it's interesting to compare 2016 to 2008 because at this time, 8 years ago, Hillary Clinton was also the favorite to win the Democratic nomination, although her standing in national polls of Democrats was more at, say, 40% of voters were supporting her as opposed to 60% now. And she's at a very, very high level for a non-incumbent president who's running for her party's nomination. And so you could have Vice President Joe Biden decide to run, former Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley. There are some others out there, but Clinton is just very, very strong. And even though she's taken some hits the first part of this year with Go ahead.
No, great point you make there, because in 2008, I remember it was Hillary Clinton and Rudy Giuliani, wasn't that?
Right. That was, everyone thought that was
where the good money was going. Yeah. Andre, you wanted to say something about the foreign policy issue?
Yeah, I just was listening to Bob, and he mentioned ISIS and how it came out of nowhere and became a big surprise for the Americans. And what I wanted to jump in with was that Americans basically often create problems and then are surprised at them. And some of the, I'm not saying that the Americans created ISIS, obviously, but some of the closest American allies in the region definitely had a hand in that.
Give you a few seconds, Bob, for a response, because I want to move on to the election.
Okay, well, I just wanted to point out to Andre that really not only did the United States create this problem, but so did the British. If we want to go back to the mid-40s when they created these countries. And now you have this one group that is trying to say, hey, we have a historic claim to this area.
Ivan, when we look at the last presidency, President Obama came into office. He said that he will end the war in Afghanistan. He will end the war in Iraq. The United States is still involved in those two countries. Are we going to see the next president of the United States also involved in what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan? That'll make 3 presidents in a row that have been involved in these two countries.
Well, I think that's what you're going to see, because those troops probably aren't going to be out of Afghanistan by the time Obama leaves, even though he wanted that to be his legacy. He wanted to get out of Iraq. Now we're back in there. And I agree with Andre. There's a lot more continuity in foreign policy. We only focus on the tangential aspects at the margins where the candidates differ. But U.S. foreign policy has a lot more consistency among Democrats and Republicans than even Americans realize, because they're all tuned into their TV sets looking at the nuanced differences of the Democrat versus the Republican, or the Republicans all together, or the Democrats all together in the nomination process. But over time, and then of course after you get elected, they may not do what they said they were going to do. Like George W. Bush said he was going to run a more humble foreign policy, and he hardly did that by invading Iraq. And going in on in a nation-building effort in Afghanistan. So I think candidates can shift as to what they say, but so they usually end up going back to what their predecessor did, and which is a fairly interventionist foreign policy.
Bob, I just want to get your view on the Democrat field right now. If we look at some of the other candidates that we mentioned, Martin O'Malley for one, Jim Webb the other. The way the American system works, it's very much up to the party leadership, isn't it? They've got to put their blessing on whom they want to be the next candidate, putting the other candidates at a disadvantage.
Well, there is that.
Yeah.
But you also have the one who's anointed by the press.
Right.
And this time around, that's Hillary Clinton. Let's not forget the concept of a story arc. That's a movie term, and it really designates a plot. We in the media love a story arc. And of course, Barack Obama had the very obvious story arc last time around when he was running. Hillary Clinton would be the first woman president of the United States if she got elected. Her problem is that she's proving so far to not be a very good candidate. She, by most accounts, mishandled the whole email scandal, where she is now accused, if you're a Republican, of getting rid of evidence by deleting all her emails in office, that type of thing. It's not so much whether she did whatever she did, but how she badly handled it. And this is something that is really bedeviling the Democratic Party, because you mentioned Jim Webb, you mentioned Joe Biden, and you mentioned Martin O'Malley,
yeah.
and people say, who?
Right.
In the case of Joe Biden, they say, they of course know who he is.
Kyle, has she got a problem?
You know, I do think that Hillary Clinton has not really run good campaigns in the past. I think if she and her team had sort of understood the rules a little bit better in 2008 in terms of getting the delegates to the convention and that sort of thing, that they probably would have won the nomination. And Hillary Clinton's Senate campaigns were also not really known as being excellent campaigns. And so, yeah, I think she's got work to do as a candidate. I frankly think it would be helpful to her to at least have some sort of nominal challenge in the primary, at least so she could sort of get back into the rhythm of actually being a candidate, because, you know, she hasn't been a active politician since the 2008 cycle.
Okay, gentlemen, we are going to take a short break right now. Much more in the U.S. presidential race when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.